westward and may become more common in the places like the Eastern Shore. So they're here to stay, and they're doing really well. The population is growing, and it's tremendous to have such a huge, beautiful species in the state of Virginia doing so well. A little bit about their biology. So males or boars typically weigh anywhere from 200 to 500 pounds, and the largest in the state of Virginia was 740 pounds in Suffolk County. And then the females or sows are smaller. They're anywhere from 100 to 250 pounds, with the largest, with some of them being over 300 pounds. And that's a pretty big female. Most of the times they're not that large, but they can certainly get that big. Now, getting to their senses, and this is unfortunately where bears come in conflict with humans, particularly when it comes to their sense of smell. They do have sight similar to ours. They can see in color, which helps them, particularly in the summertime, to forage for small, colorful berries or for insects. But they do have poor long distance vision. And oftentimes bears will stand up, like you see in this photo here on the left, to get a better idea of their surroundings, whether it's to see something coming from a distance or potentially to smell something. And that's because their sense of smell is unbeatable. It is said to be 7 times greater than that of a bloodhound. So if you know what a bloodhound, that breed of dog, is capable of doing, you can hand it a t-shirt from a lost child and it'll go tracking through the woods and find that individual. A black bear's sense of smell is simply 7 times greater than that, which is really hard to fathom and wrap your head around. And this is where, unfortunately, they follow their nose, and it leads them to oftentimes human-provided foods, such as trash and bird feed, and we'll talk about that. And then, therefore, bears come into conflict with humans. They do have acute hearing, nothing spectacular. It's certainly better than ours, but really that sense of smell is what it comes down to. And when bears stand up, like you see in this photo, it is certainly not an aggressive behavior. It does not mean that the bear is about to attack. It is simply out of curiosity and to get a better idea of what may be coming, or to hear maybe something that they heard coming through the woods. Now, black bears are mostly solitary. Really, they only come together during the breeding season, which is in the summertime, typically June and July. Black bears are also very intelligent, which is a really cool thing, but also another detriment for us to deal with, because they can figure out how to get into things, how to break into things to get to food and whatnot. They're also very inquisitive, very curious. And black bears are what we call crepuscular, which means they're most active at dawn and dusk. But with that being said, they can be active any time of day. And they are considered to be omnivores, so they eat both plant and animal material. And they really are driven by their stomachs, and their sense of smell is leading them to their next meal, whatever that may be. And they're always searching for food, particularly this time of year. Their general habitat requirements are just really like any species. They need food, water, escape, cover, and den sites. And they really do utilize a variety of habitat types. They can be found in mature forest with mass-producing trees or acorns. Also early successional habitats with great green forage, soft mast, blackberry thickets, clear cuts. They really utilize various habitats depending on the time of year and whatever food source they're taking advantage of. And getting into their movements, and I think this is important to understand, because seasonally we see different changes, if you will, in bear activity, and therefore how they can come in conflict with us as landowners here in Virginia. So in the springtime right now, our bears are actively starting to emerge from their winter's den. And so they would have spent a couple of months, about 3 months, really not consuming anything or drinking anything. So they wake up very hungry, and they're searching for food. In addition to that, this time of year, their food, their natural forage, is very limited. As you probably know, when you look out your door, there's not been a whole lot of green up yet, so their natural forage is slow to come about, and so they're really hungry, searching for food. And this oftentimes, this time of year, brings them in conflict with humans, because they are so hungry, they can't find what they need naturally, so they come close to neighborhoods and look for trash and bird feed and dog food. In the summer, like I mentioned, is mating season. So they really kind of stick to themselves and go back into the woods, which is really great for us. Yearling bears really distribute or disperse at that point. They go out and establish their own territories and home ranges. And then in the fall, bears go into a hyperphagia, which is called an eating frenzy. And it's when they really start packing on the pounds in preparation for winter. So they will spend up to 18 hours of the day active, foraging for food, and really honing in on mass crops such as acorns. About 75% of the bear's diet is vegetative matter. So I mentioned that they are technically omnivores, but the big proportion of their diet is vegetative matter. 25% of that is insects, maybe some small animals, roadkill that they may come upon, or something that's easy to capture and kill. For example, maybe like a possum. Doesn't require a whole lot of energy or effort to try and capture and kill that animal. Bears are smart. They are strong and powerful, but they also can be a little lazy. So they're really not going to work that hard for a meal if they don't have to. Sometimes they will prey on deer fawns in the summer. Moving on to really the meat of bears. Bears, unfortunately, as I mentioned, and maybe some of you have encountered this yourself, they come close to us occasionally. And so there are always conflicts that we deal with as biologists. It's tough because bears are smart, as I mentioned, and their sense of smell is unbeatable. So they are drawn to these human-provided food sources, and then we have to deal with the consequences of what that means. And I just wanted to throw this up here. There's no need to read all of this text, but I wanted to make it known that it is illegal in the state of Virginia to feed bears intentionally and unintentionally. And we take this very seriously, not just with bears, but with many other species, because animals or wildlife that gain access to human-provided foods quickly become what we call habituated, which means they're losing their natural fear of people. And when that happens, potentially we are looking at sort of unsafe encounters, because bears will start seeking out homes and humans because they have associated those locations, those people, as a food reward. And so we take this seriously. It's something that we always like to convey to folks that we hope you take seriously as well. Now, when we talk about how can we reduce or eliminate conflicts with bears on our property, it really comes down to securing any and all potential food sources. And that could be any of the things you see on this list. Mostly it's trash, but also bird feeders. Sometimes it's crops, apiaries, occasionally livestock and poultry feed, grills even serve as attractants. So there are various things that bears will hone in on and try and get into. And so it's a matter of us being responsible in taking care of those attractants, securing or removing them. And if there's anything you take away from tonight's presentation when it comes to bears, the most important thing you can do to reduce any sort of bear conflict is to secure your garbage. And there are a number of different ways that you can do that. You can simply just keep it in a secure building until the morning of your trash pickup or until you take it to the dump yourself. So whether that's your garage or some sort of outdoor shed, you can retrofit your trash can to be considered bear resistant. And those are the photos you see here on the right. It's just a matter of adding hardware to the can itself so that the bear can't gain access. You can build a trash caddy, which is that wooden structure you see on the bottom left. Or in fact, they actually manufacture and sell bear resistant trash cans. And these are trash cans that get tested out at captive facilities. And like this picture here with that grizzly bear, they see whether or not bears can actually break into them. So there are many different ways folks can secure their garbage. Again, this being the most important thing you can do as a landowner to keep bears from coming onto your property and causing any sort of conflict. But in addition to garbage, as I mentioned, there are many other attractants that bears love. Bird feeders, or more specifically bird seed, being a huge one. Particularly, again, this time of year, again, bears are emerging from those dens. They're very hungry. People like to feed the birds, me included. Our advice is really that you remove your bird feeders entirely from April to November. And therefore, you only have your bird feeders out when bears are much less active during the winter months. And in fact, that's when birds likely would need the seed the most. to sort of supplement their natural forage. So this is our advice. We really strongly advise this because bears will find your bird feeder and they will tear it down and cause a lot of damage. And once they've located that bird feeder on your property, they will continue to come back to it, particularly if it's a reliable food source for them. So without removing it, your issues are going to keep going and going, and the bear will return. Another thing that bears really love is dog food and cat food. If you tend to feed your dogs or cats or other domestic animals outside, only feed them what they're going to consume. Be sure to remove that bowl after they're finished. Certainly don't leave a bag of food or a bowl full of food outside overnight. Secure that food in a strong place, whether that's inside the house or the garage or a shed, and don't leave it on a screen porch. A lot of times people think that they can just leave their garbage, their birdseed bag, their pet food on a screen porch, but to a bear, a screen is really nothing. They just walk right through it, tear right through it, and they will do that to get to a food source. So it's really important that you don't leave that stuff outside that they can still access. And another really important thing to remember is, bears do like some crops, particularly big agricultural crops such as cornfields. In the late summer, bears will wreak havoc on cornfields, unfortunately. But on a smaller scale, they really do like orchards and vineyards. So if you have apple trees, pear trees, whatever you may have on your property, it's important that you consider potentially fencing out wildlife from those trees, whether that be through electric fencing, which Allie will talk a little bit more about later. Certainly pick up any ripe fruit that has fallen and remove that fruit so that it's not acting as a sort of long-term attractant to bears, like this photo here on the right, just full of apples on the ground. And many different wildlife species, not just bears, will take advantage of that. And again, they identify where these food sources are, and it's a positive food reward for that animal. So they want to come back night after night and continue to eat off these apples. So just something to keep in mind of if any of you are orchard owners or have vineyards or crops of any kind. When it comes to sort of vegetable gardens, bears really don't seem to cause as much damage or enter those sorts of spaces as often as they do, say, apple orchards or vineyards. So we don't hear a lot of concerns from people with bears getting into their tomatoes or your squash or zucchini. It seems to be something that they really leave alone, and instead they go to things like apple trees. Another thing that bears really love, if any of you have apiaries, they will destroy your apiaries, unfortunately. And again, it all goes back to that sense of smell. They're not necessarily interested in the bees. They're interested in the larvae, so the young bees, and then also the honey has a strong smell. But if they can gain access to these apiaries, they will destroy them. And unfortunately, really the only way to protect these apiaries is through electric fencing, which again, Allie will briefly mention, but we have some good information on our website about how you can properly install electric fencing, whether it's around a chicken coop or your apiaries. We have a few different versions that you can look into. And I just wanted to throw this in here because I think there's always a lot of misconceptions about what you should and shouldn't do if you encounter a bear. And this is true for all wildlife. You should never run. Do not run. Another thing, if you only take away two things from tonight's presentation, it's secure your garbage and do not run. That's just good common practice, because if you run, you turn your back and start running, you can elicit a chase response in many different wildlife, not just bear. So it's important that you just remain calm and leave the area. And sometimes if the bear sees you, you may calmly, walk away, still facing the bear. Sometimes they say, put your hands above your head and wave them back and forth and say something to the bear. You want them to know that you're there. And bears are so naturally wary of humans that it will likely see and hear you and tear off in the other direction because they don't want to encounter humans. They simply want to avoid us at all costs. It's unfortunately only those habituated bears that maybe are less afraid and may not be as scared as they naturally should be. And finally, to sort of wrap things up on bears, I always like to tell people to scare that bear. It's a phrase that we use a lot. When bears come close to homes and people, we do not want it to be a comfortable experience for the bear. two things we want to happen. We don't want the bear to get any sort of food reward, again, whether that be through garbage or birdseed. And then the second thing is we want it to be a negative encounter or a negative situation. And you can do that with simply scaring the bear, whether that be your human dominance, you're yelling, screaming at the bear, using an air horn, setting off your car alarm. Bear spray is another tool that is useful to have, particularly if you spend a lot of time camping or hiking in bear country. You can use a paintball gun. You can use non-lethal rubber rounds in a shotgun, slingshot, motion activated, anything. But it's really important to instill that natural fear back into the bear. And we can simply do that by scaring it using a multitude of different tools.
All right. So we're going to move on here to talk about bobcats. These are beautiful animals again. And if you've ever had the chance to see one in the wild, it's a really special experience because they're just majestic and incredible. So they're in the family Felidae, with their scientific name being Lynx rufus. I'll mention it again later, but these species are most often confused with a lynx, a Canadian lynx. But they are, in fact, their own species. So these animals weigh about 15 to 35 pounds, so about the size of a small to medium-sized dog. They're usually about 1.5 to 2 feet tall, 2 to 2.5 feet long, but their size can really vary. I've seen bobcats much larger than this in the wild, and I've seen some really small ones. And when I say Bergman's rule there, that's just a rule that states basically the further north that you go, the larger a mammal species will be, and usually a little bit plumper too, because they're in way colder temperatures. So they need to be able to survive in those types of temperatures. So I'm sure many of you have seen pictures of bobcats before. They're that buff to brown color. Some of them can be really red. Again, with all of our wildlife or mammal species here in Virginia, color can really vary. But usually they're that buff to brown color. They do have those spots or stripes that are usually black or brown. They can be both. And like a lot of mammal species, usually animals are a little bit lighter on their underside and a little darker on their back. One thing that's really important to note about any cat tracks compared to dogs is that cats have retractable claws. So when they're running or walking, those claws are not out. So if you see a track in the wild, it might look similar to a dog, but it's not going to have those claw marks. And you can see in that image there too that it has those kind of W-shaped lobe there at the bottom, as opposed to a dog that just has one indent. So those are just good things to keep in mind if you're out in the field wondering maybe what attacked your chickens. If you see a track, you can decipher whether or not it was a coyote, a fox, or maybe a bobcat. So like I mentioned, they can be confused with a lynx just because of those ear tufts, the fluffy face, things like that. They have those similar traits. One really cool trait about bobcats is they have little white spots in the back of their ears, and the kittens really follow those in the dark. So that's just something fun to mention. They do have that bobbed tail, which is where they get their name. It's black with a white underside. So bobcats have a really wide range of habitat. So they can be all the way from Mexico, all the way into Canada. And this is really because they can live in a lot of different types of habitat. They can live in those cold coniferous forests all the way into our hardwood swampy areas. They can live in the desert and in dense early young vegetation. So clearly they can live pretty much anywhere and they find a way to survive. So they're crepuscular, which is such a hard word to say, just means that they're active at dawn and dusk, most active at dawn and dusk. Like I mentioned before, these are super secretive, solitary animals. So seeing one in the wild isn't common, but that doesn't mean that they don't try to sneak up onto your properties and get more familiar with what you might have in your backyard. They don't want to be around you at all, but you might be attracting them in other ways. They are territorial species as well, and they really use a lot of scent marking, not only for mating, but just for marking their territory, defending their territory, and especially the females using it around her den. So when it comes to their food habits, this is pretty much the only species that we're going to talk about today that's truly carnivorous, meaning that it really doesn't eat any vegetation. Bears, coyotes, fox, all of those species will eat some type of vegetation. Some might be a little bit more carnivorous than others, but this is the only species that truly only eats meat. And this again varies. It can be rabbits all the way to mice, voles, squirrels, things like that, pretty much whatever they can get their hands on. They're incredible hunters. They will feed on fawns, and especially adults that are weak and sick and things like that. If they have a larger prey, they will cache it, which means that they just hide and bury it, similar to what you hear mountain lions doing as well. Occasionally, they will eat things like snakes and lizards and whatnot, and domestic animals, which is why we're talking about them today. But that's not as frequent. Like I said, they're amazing hunters, so they do find a lot of their food in the wild. They're great climbers, so they can get into those bird nests and things like that, like many cats, including our cats that like to live out in our backyards. They often hunt birds, but they can travel 2 to 7 miles per night hunting, and they're incredibly fast. So they're really, really great at catching their prey.
All right, sliding right into coyotes, which most of you likely know something about, or certainly maybe have seen one throughout the state of Virginia. They're in the family Canidae, so they are very closely related to dogs, and their Latin name is Canis latrans, which actually translates to barking dog, which is fitting. Now, a little bit about the historical range of coyotes. You may or may not know, coyotes are a relatively new thing to Virginia. Pre-settlement, they really only ranged from southern Canada to northern Mexico, and really sort of elongated through that prairie region of the Midwest. Now, in the early 20th century, they started to expand their range further south into Mexico and further west, and also a little bit further north into Canada, and those arrows showing movement into Alaska as well. This figure here gives you more of a better idea of their range expansion post-1900s, the early 1900s. That historical range is sort of in the darker colored orange there, and then the arrows showing you the direction of expansion and the time frame. So in the early 1900s, they started to expand further eastward towards Virginia. Now, there are many reasons for this range expansion that we see in coyotes, and this is just one example here on the screen, would be the extirpation, of the other large predators that we once had on our landscape here in Virginia, and that would be the gray wolf and the mountain lion. And the last gray wolf killed in the state of Virginia was in 1910, and the last mountain lion killed in the state of Virginia was in 1882. So if you reflect back on the timeline of that coyote expansion, it mends really well to the extirpation of these large predators, making room for this new predator, the coyote. Now, I mentioned their Latin name translates to barking dog. They are closely related, of course, to the dog families. They have very dog-like features. They have a long, bushy tail that is typically always held downwards. And so that is sometimes a good distinguish. Some people confuse coyotes and dogs all the time. And most dogs, not all dogs, have their tail held up or up high and it's wagging. Coyotes will very rarely, if ever, see that. It's always held down low against the body and it's long and bushy. They have a slender muzzle, kind of fox-like. And coyotes can be of various weights and sizes, but typically a male coyote in Virginia is anywhere from 35 to 45 pounds, and a female may be anywhere from 30 to 40 pounds. But again, that can vary, particularly based on diet and habitat. In addition to all the variation that coyotes experience, their colors also vary. And we see this in Virginia. There can be all sorts of different colored coyotes, sort of a light brown, tawny color to more of a salt and pepper gray, all the way to black. And this is common. We get pictures all the time, and people tell us that they saw a coyote that was sort of a non-typical color presentation compared to the very classic that you see there on the left. But this is normal. It's not any cause for concern. And coyotes' hair is really neat. They have these outer guard hairs that each individual hair has different pigments that make it up. And you can see that here on this sort of zoomed in photo. So each hair follicle, those outer guard hairs, can be made up of various colors, giving to the coat color of the coyote itself. Now, what are coyotes eating? As Allie mentioned, they are omnivorous. So they are eating both plant and animal material. And it's anything from small mammals such as rabbits, mice, voles, squirrels, deer fawns in the summertime, but also soft mast, vegetation, insects, and then the occasional livestock or domestic animal. A little bit about their social organization. They really center around an adult pair, and then there could be a pack associated with that adult pair, anywhere from 3 to 8 individuals. And those individuals are usually very closely related to the adult pair. So they might be their offspring and their offspring's offspring. So there's often sort of familial ties to these groups. And a really neat thing about coyotes, this is not true for many species, both adults help rear the young. And in fact, other members of the pack, particularly if they are directly related to those adults, will also provide care for the young. So pretty neat dynamic there. They will sometimes hunt in groups for larger prey, such as an adult deer. They are mostly nocturnal, so they're most active at night. And we'll mention this again at the end of the presentation. That doesn't necessarily mean that a coyote out in the middle of the day is cause for concern. Just by definition, most of their activity is limited to nighttime. Now, their home range can vary widely. They can have anywhere from only a 2 square mile home range all the way up to 50. And that really depends on habitat quality and whether or not they're finding the forage that they need in the spaces that they're living in.
All right, so we're moving on to our foxes. So I'm sure most of you have seen a fox. We actually have 2 fox species here in Virginia. We have the red fox there on the left, and a gray fox as well. They're both in the family Canidae, and I'm going to do you a favor and not butcher the scientific name of the gray fox. So I'll let you just go ahead and look at that one. It's a hard one to say, as most of these Latin names are. So we're going to start off with the red fox. It's got a very sharp, elongated muzzle, much longer than a gray fox usually. Its front feet and back of ears are black. And something really important to keep in mind and to note is that our red foxes are going to have a white tipped tail. And once I get to the gray fox slide, I'll tell you why that's an important thing to remember. Red foxes are definitely the most common fox species that people see, and that's because they can live in a variety of habitats. They can live on farmlands, little tiny patches of woods, marshes, streams, and as humans, we're great at fragmenting habitats, so we're great at breaking up that habitat, and red foxes especially are really good at adapting to that and being able to live in the habitats that we're creating. So these species are omnivores, and their diet is really driven by what's available. So they'll eat mice, they'll eat berries, rabbits, things like that, basically whatever is available to them. So here's our gray fox. So it's got that salt and pepper fur, but they can be a little bit red. So sometimes people aren't 100% sure which fox they're looking at when they see a fox in the wild. And the reason I mentioned that white tipped tail with the red fox is because the one difference that's very consistent between these 2 species is that the red fox will have the white tip on the tail and a gray fox will have the black tail. These species are a little bit more selective when it comes to their habitat, but again, they can really adapt pretty well, but they do prefer those deciduous forests, wooded areas. They're a little bit more secretive in that way. Again, they're omnivores, but they're a little bit more of a heavy mouser, meaning that they hunt a little bit more than a red fox will. But they also tend to have more fruit in their diet than a red fox. So those are just a couple of differences, both really great species. Again, another thing to mention when you're looking at tracks, sometimes people aren't sure whether they're looking at a dog track or a coyote or a fox. Obviously, out of these three species, usually a fox track is going to be a lot smaller. But one thing to mention is that a dog's pad is a lot bigger than a coyote or a fox. So a kind of cheat or rule of thumb that we like to think of is if you can draw an X through the center of that pad, that's usually going to be your dog. Whereas if it's a little bit of a more narrow pad and that X is kind of in between the pad and the toes. I'm trying to think of the word to say there. Yeah. Then that's usually going to be your coyote. And there's some size cheat sheets, and on our website we have some track guides and things like that you can look at, which we'll show that link there at the end. So this slide's titled Nuisance Foxes, but we're actually talking about bobcats, foxes, and coyotes in this slide. So when it comes to what they're attracted to, why they're on your property, it's usually going to be driven to pet food, trash, chickens and poultry, rabbits and mice, and den location. So for the most part, a lot of these things are pretty similar to your black bear, other than maybe the last two things. So when I say den locations, I'm talking about basically places where they're going to den up and have their young. So there's a lot of things that you can do to avoid or to be proactive so that you can keep these animals off of your property. The number one thing is just not feeding wildlife at all. And I'm not talking about your bird feeders, although as Sarah mentioned, from April to November, we really encourage you to take those feeders down. There's a lot of natural food for those birds at this time of year or getting into this time of year. So they don't need that supplemental food as much anymore. And it's also attracting other wildlife. But I just mean, sometimes we have individuals who like to see more wildlife in their backyard, so they set out extra dog food or something like that for them. And we really ask you not to do that because, as Sarah mentioned, animals become habituated and expect you to feed them. As Sarah mentioned, when talking about black bears, we also encourage you to secure all garbage, pet and livestock feed in some type of wildlife-proof container or in a shed or a building that's very secure. And when it comes to those den locations, as I mentioned, you just making sure you close up any openings under buildings, under porches, under steps. Sometimes, especially if it's a vacation home or something like that, where people aren't frequently going in and out, wildlife love to use those locations for dens. And something that's really important, especially with these 3 or 4 species, I guess, that I'm talking about right now, is just managing your landscaping and the areas around your home to dissuade rabbits and mice and those small rodents from making nests and living in these areas. So if you have really, really dense landscaping where all these animals feel safe and covered, that might draw more foxes, more bobcats, things like that to your property because they can smell those small mammals and they'll dig in to try to find them. So opening up that landscaping a little bit more, just making it a little less rabbit and mouse friendly might help you solve some of these issues. Another huge thing for all wildlife is just fencing. And I'm actually going to have a slide about fencing. But we always, pretty much the number one way to keep all wildlife out is to build a fence, whether it's an electric fence or a woven wire fence, which we'll get into. And another really great tool is just livestock guard dogs or donkeys. So if you have livestock, this is something that's really great to consider. It's an awesome tool, maybe a little bit more of an expensive tool, but it is an awesome one to utilize if you're able to do that. So when we talk about fencing, for biologists, the number one thing we can recommend is electric fencing, 40 inches in height, usually a 5-strand fence with 8-inch spacing, and some 14 gauge wire so these animals can't chew through it. Obviously with electric fencing, it doesn't always work the way you want it to, so we want to make sure these animals can't chew through it or anything like that. But one thing I will mention when it comes to electric fencing is that fox, coyote, bobcats will all dig underneath the fence. So the best thing that you can do is double up electric fencing with a woven wire fence that's buried 8 inches into the ground. So even if they try to dig underneath it, they're not going to be able to get under it. I know, and this is an argument I think that a lot of landowners have, and I mean, I have a garden, I have an orchard, so I completely understand it's not always easy to front that cost for fencing, but it's almost always worth it, just because the damage that you're getting in your orchard or the amount of chickens that were killed by these animals, usually that cost will pretty much even out. So it's usually always worth it, and almost always works. Fencing almost always works, especially compared to some of the other tools that we have in our toolbox when it comes to dissuading wildlife. So this is a lot on this slide here, but there are some other options other than just trying to keep wildlife off your property. There are some options for removal. So it is legal in Virginia to trap coyotes, foxes, and bobcats. You also can utilize licensed trappers, which that link right there, we have an awesome tool on our website that has all of the licensed trapper, or a chunk of licensed trappers in Virginia listed there for you, so you can search them by county. There is no kill permit required to remove coyotes. It's a continuous open season since they are a nuisance species, so you can hunt and trap coyotes year round. That being said, for fox and bobcats, there are both trapping and hunting seasons, so you have to trap and hunt these species within those seasons for it to be legal. The licensed trappers, if you do call on them, are very familiar with all of these seasons. But if you're planning on doing any of this yourself, it's very important to be familiar not only with your local county ordinances when it comes to firearms, trapping, things like that. All cities and counties have their own set of laws that we have no control over as an agency, but we do have control over these seasons. One thing that is tricky, but it's very important to mention about trapping is that you cannot relocate wildlife. When I say this, I mean, you can, if you see a raccoon or a fox that's right by your house, you can trap it in like a have-a-heart trap, for example, and move it to the back 40 on your farm and release it there if it's on your property. But you cannot take an animal in a trap off of your property and release it anywhere else in the state of Virginia. If a target animal is caught in a trap, it either needs to be released on site on your property or humanely dispatched. And by that, I mean you have to kill the animal. So again, these are things that licensed trappers are very familiar with, but if you are interested in trapping on your own property, it's really important to be familiar with all of the rules and regulations associated with that. As Sarah mentioned earlier, all of the species that we talked about today are most commonly crepuscular or nocturnal, meaning dawn and dusk, they're most active, or during the night. But sometimes we see these species out during the day, and we get calls all the time where somebody is like, oh my gosh, there's a coyote in my backyard. Or, oh, I saw a bobcat today and it was the middle of the day. That's not always a need for concern. Sometimes this is because these animals are getting supplemental food during the day, or they're getting fed elsewhere. But sometimes they're just hunting. Sometimes they're just hungry and they're looking for food during the day, and that's not always a need for concern. But it is really important that we're mindful of wildlife diseases, especially those that can be transmitted to humans. So if you do see any of these species foaming at the mouth, you normally would think when it comes to rabies, or just acting strange, maybe they're circling or they're very unafraid or not reacting to presence of people or something like that, that is something to be concerned about. All of these species can carry rabies and mange as well, which if you're not familiar with mange, it's when you see those really naked, hairless animals. Sometimes they'll have scabs and things like that on them from all of the itching. And we are the point of contact for sick or injured wildlife. So definitely let us know. We have a number on a slide here in a minute that you can call if you do see anything that you think might be sick. But just because you see an animal out during the day does not necessarily mean it has rabies. And one thing that we always like to mention, do not handle wildlife unless it's necessary. There's all kinds of diseases, just like us. People carry all kinds of things. So you don't want to be handling any wildlife because you might pass something accidentally onto your pets or to yourself. And if you do decide to trap on your property or you need to handle wildlife, you always have to wear gloves. That's just something that we recommend. We do it every single time we handle any wildlife. So it's just the smart thing to do.
All right, I'm going to bring us all together here. There's only 2 or 3 more slides. So we wanted to recap, we talked about bears, bobcats, coyotes, and the 2 species of foxes. And I think I mentioned at the beginning that we might sound a little redundant, and that's because a lot of the technical assistance for all of these overlaps. It really comes down to do not feed wildlife. Managing and securing or removing all attractants on your property that these species would be drawn to. Again, whether that be the pet food, the bird seed, the garbage, chicken food, all sorts of things. And then, thinking about ways to prevent access to these items would be fencing, like electric or woven wire. And typically you're putting that around your chicken coops or maybe your orchard, if feasible. Like Allie mentioned, we know a lot of times for landowners, you may have very large spaces that house livestock or gardens. And, it might be really tough to consider fencing out that entire area. But oftentimes, as Allie mentioned, the upfront costs may be high, but the long-term rewards are there. And it's just a matter of being willing to do that on the front end. Closing up any openings under and into buildings. And this is just good property management because all sorts of things could get under buildings, whether it's groundhogs, skunks, bears, even, especially in the wintertime looking for dens. And then manage your small mammal populations, whether you do that through manipulating your landscape, like Allie mentioned, or otherwise. And this phone number here at the bottom is our wildlife conflict helpline. This is a really great number to save because you can call this number and speak to a biologist about anything wildlife related. It can be about snakes, it can be about birds, bears, anything and everything, sick and injured wildlife. It's a really great team of biologists that staff this helpline, and they will provide you with the appropriate technical assistance and, more importantly, pass on, if need be, whatever issues you're experiencing to the necessary biologist, whether that be someone like Allie or I, or maybe one of our project leaders. And really quick, I wanted to include this in here in case folks were interested. We are not putting on this presentation, but they're at the Prince Edward County Library at the end of April 28th at 6 p.m. to be exact. There's going to be a Snakes in Suburbia presentation put on by the Prince Edward Soil and Water Conservation District. Something you guys might be interested in. You'll learn more about local snakes, their benefits, and how to peacefully coexist. And then finally, we just want to open it up for questions. Allie and I's email address is there on the slide. And please visit our website for tons of more information about each of these species. The electric fencing guidelines are under the bear webpage. And we failed to mention at the beginning the counties that we cover. So we're both district wildlife biologists, and I cover sort of the central Piedmont. So I have Nelson County, Amherst, Appomattox, Campbell, Buckingham, Charlotte, and Halifax counties.
And I'm kind of the central to south central Piedmont. So I have Cumberland, Prince Edward, Brunswick, Mecklenburg, Lunenburg, Nottoway. I said Cumberland. I'm missing one. I can't even remember what I said.
Mecklenburg, Brunswick, Nottoway, Amelia.
Amelia, sorry. Thank you. Amelia. It's hard to remember them all. And one thing I will mention too, if you haven't checked out our website, it really is a great resource. We have lots of brochures and supplemental information on all of the species that we talked about today and more. We have information on wildlife diseases, some more tools that you can use to deter wildlife from your property. There's a lot on there. So I really encourage you to explore that if you get the chance. So for now, we will open it up to questions.
I see that Kendall asked, I'll quickly address the one that Kendall put in the chat. She asked, is there a large population of bobcat in Cumberland County? That's a great question, Kendall. We certainly can't answer with any sort of hard and fast numbers or a population estimate, but for certain there are bobcats in Cumberland County. They really are so adaptable. They can be pretty much anywhere in the state. So absolutely they are there, but we don't know. We can't say that this is our population estimate and it's X number of animals or individuals.
A lot of these species that we're talking about today, when it comes to population sizes, we get a lot of that information from hunting and trapping numbers. So obviously that can vary based on the types of hunting that occurs in each of these counties. So that's why we really can't. You definitely are not going to be able to go out there and count bobcats because they're very secretive. A lot of these animals we don't live in a prairie environment where we could fly over and do a count because we're a very heavy wooded state. But there definitely are lots of bobcats in Cumberland County.
Kendall asked again, sorry, there might be folks on the phone or on video who have questions, but real quick, Kendall said, any particular animal that preys on waterfowl, such as ducks and geese? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those are prey items. For coyotes could grab one of those species if they wanted to. Bobcats, particularly like sick and injured individuals, maybe a duck or geese that can't fly or has an injured leg, predators are going to hone in on those particular individuals more so than the healthy adults that are able to fly away quickly. But yeah, they can do that for sure.
And I will mention too that especially when they're laying, when there's eggs and things like that, bobcats especially, and some of these other species will definitely prey on those nests, whether it be the young or the eggs themselves.
And raccoons too are bad nest thieves. Snakes. Yeah, absolutely. So during the breeding season for waterfowl, pretty much everything and anything can smell those nests or happens to just stumble upon them and will consume the eggs. A lot of times the female or can get up off of the nest in advance of the predator approaching and they don't get consumed, but those eggs for sure.
And Patricia mentioned that she had coyotes sunning on top of hay bales. That's amazing. Wow. I'm sure that would have been a beautiful picture.
Sarah and Allie, thank you so much. Does anyone else have any questions? If you need to unmute, you will see your mute microphone down at the lower left. Do we have any other questions?
Yes, we do. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Collins. I am a master naturalist. But I'm actually a Virginia master naturalist, but I'm located in New York. And, I know for years, I want to say at least a decade, the bear population has been a real issue in New Jersey. Now, I know that up here, it's a lot more populated, at least on the coast and in city areas versus rural Virginia, where I'm from. But I was curious, had you guys, have there been any notation on an increase in, say, I guess, run-ins with the public or an increase in population where, say, there's a new large-scale development and it's pushing them out? I'm just curious if when people call or if they log in, seeing an animal, is there an uptick in areas where there's new development versus rural areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm a little bit familiar with New Jersey and sort of the multitude of conflicts that they have been and are currently experiencing with bears. So, but yes, so that helpline that we mentioned, they really keep great data on the number of calls received and the type of species that call was in reference to. So over time, as our bear population has grown and expanded in range, and I kind of briefly mentioned that it's a conservation success story, we have seen sort of this precipitous increase in both the bear population and at the same time, the human population in the state of Virginia, even in some rural areas, is increasing. So we absolutely have seen an increase in the number of bears and also the number of conflicts that people are experiencing. And in terms of sort of community housing developments, depending on the scale of those developments, they certainly displace wildlife. And so if there was a bear that lived in this patch of woods and now it's houses, that bear is going to come around and get into things like garbage. So, and the caveat I'll say to that though, is that one individual bear can generate lots of calls. So sometimes you have to be careful to say, oh my gosh, we received 400 calls last year about black bears. Well, that may not be necessarily 400 individual animals, because one bear can do a lot of damage over the course of one night in an entire neighborhood. They have large home ranges and they'll just knock over trash can after trash can, which may generate 15 phone calls. So you have to keep that in mind. But absolutely, we've seen an increase in both the bear population and conflict calls.
Yeah, and just in addition to that, especially in the counties that I'm the biologist over, they're very, very timber heavy counties. So if we see like a recent clear cut or something like that, we definitely in the surrounding areas have seen a little bit more bear conflict because they're pushed out of their home range or the natural habitat that they've been living in. So, I mean, a couple months down the line, an area that's been clear cutted might be great bear habitat because all of a sudden it becomes dense cover again. But for a little while, we do see those bears pushed out of that habitat, so they may cause more conflict in the surrounding areas. Just wanted to add that really quickly.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Yeah, good question, Collins. I'm looking at the chat here. So Jill asked, if we have a duck who is sitting on a nest, should we try to move the nest and duck out? Okay, yeah, that's a good question. So it would be tempting to do so because we did just say that pretty much everything will eat either the duck sitting on the nest or more likely the eggs. But that would not be something that we recommend that you do. Really leaving wildlife alone and leaving wildlife wild is the most important and best thing we can do. And so while it may seem tempting and you may be concerned, we would suggest that you do not intervene, because moving that nest would likely potentially just make it so that it's unsuccessful. And that may just be because of the particular location you choose to move it to, or that the parental pair can't find it. So intervening is certainly not something that's necessary, nor would it be something that we would recommend. But it is a good question because predators can find them, and that is something to at least know.
And just to add to that, that kind of I can answer that goes for all species. So, for example, if you see a fawn laying in a field and you have coyotes, we do not recommend that you remove that fawn either, because obviously that doe will not be able to find that fawn again, or may reject it in the future. So any wildlife should be left alone. Unfortunately, sometimes we also have to say you just have to let nature take its course. And the best thing that you can do is be proactive and try to manage these populations, as we mentioned in this PowerPoint, on your property. And keep note, I mean, if you see that an uptick in foxes on your property is causing a lot of damage to other species, then you can maybe evaluate how you can manage that fox population. And this is something that we're willing to help with. So if you see common issues on your property, reach out to one of us and we can kind of lead you through how we would recommend to approach these situations, or call that wildlife conflict helpline. But it's always best to leave any wildlife alone.
Absolutely. Kendall asked us to briefly mention what we're going to cover on part 2, which is on April 19th. Hopefully you guys will all be able to join again. We're going to talk about a bunch of different species. So it'll be sort of a Jeopardy fast sort of deal, but we'll cover hopefully a little bit of biology behavior, but then more importantly, what you can and can't do. So it's going to be raccoons, owls, groundhogs, deer, possum, snapping turtles, and muskrat. So that's what we're going to cover in part 2 on April 19th. Hope you guys can join. Let's see. Another Jill said we caught bears on our game camera in Prospect, Virginia. They crushed and trashed 8 bird feeders until we realized that it was bears. Thanks for the presentation. Thanks, Jill. Yeah, they love bird seed.
And they're very stubborn. So if they get it once, they're going to keep coming back. And even sometimes if you remove those feeders or put up that garbage, they will continue to visit a couple times just to make sure you didn't accidentally put it back out again. So if you do have a bear that's on your property and you do take down your bird feeder, we do recommend you give it a couple weeks. Hopefully maybe just don't put it back out until the end of the bear activity season. But if you are going to put it back out, we do recommend you wait a while because that bear might come back and check out whether or not you put it back up. And Jill asked if she has access to the recording, and I'm going to leave that to Kendall to answer.
We are trying to record this. As long as everything is successful, we will have that available probably within the next week.
Well, and Kendall, something we also could do is we could provide a PDF of this presentation, and you could distribute that as you'd like.
That would be wonderful because y'all have a lot of great contact information in here and you've provided so much information. I want folks to be able to go back and reference. And
Sure.
I know we moved pretty quickly, so it's hard to read everything while listening.
Yeah. Do we have any more questions?
Yes, if you can. I know this is a difficult question to answer, but can you tell me what it's similar to or kind of what a bobcat sounds like in the night?
That's a great question. You could, I know that there are good recordings out there. So I don't know if you've already tried to do a YouTube or a Google search. If you just search sounds that bobcats make, I will tell you that it doesn't sound pretty at all.
They're horrifying.
It sounds terrible. It's kind of like
it's like a child screaming.
Yeah, it's not pleasant. Allie's trying to pull one up so you can hear it.
I don't know if this video will play.
It's like a scream, a screech.
And they're the dawn to
yeah, and you guys hear that?
I did. I was not expecting that.
It's very different than I thought.
But it really sounds like a child or a monster screaming. It's a really awful sound.
Yeah, I would encourage you if you ever get a recording of it or just anything that sounds funny, you're not sure what it is, you could always just reach out and say, hey, can you tell me what this is? Do you have any idea? But yeah, we get that a lot. And sometimes we're like, oh gosh, I don't know, because maybe the quality isn't as great, but in general, bobcats sound terrible. And it would be one of those things that when you heard it, you would probably immediately be like, what was that? And be, scratching your head like that was strange. That's a bobcat.
Yeah,
probably.
We have a lot of people who that's some of their evidence of Bigfoot is that they've heard something like that in the woods, and it's almost always a bobcat because they do sound like it's just weird. It's awful.
Yeah.
All right, if we don't have any more questions, I just want to thank Allie and Sarah again, and I'm already looking forward to April 19th. So guys, save up your questions for real quickly: possum, raccoon, owls, and what was
groundhog, deer, snapping turtle, and muskrat.
Okay, yeah, the snapping turtles. I know we have some folks that are very interested in that. So that'll be a good class. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks for
everyone.
being here, everyone.
Have a great evening. See you next time.
Okay, bye-bye.